Hello and welcome to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast with your host, Buddy Sotelo Esquire, and Dr. Mike Leno, wrestling's premier photographer. Do you want to introduce our guest for tonight?
Yes, and actually, I don't know this gentleman, but he sounds like a great wrestling historian out of primarily Manitoba, and we can get into some great history there. He is an aficionado of wrestling magazines and all things wrestling. And what a great, Winnipeg, for example, what a great Al Tomko, the promoter, legend, and Ontario. We were talking a little bit about Montreal. I'll be talking later because I watched this morning Backlash from France. It was actually a very good pay-per-view, insane audience. But before I forget, at the Kentucky Derby, I made sure, I just had it so I could rewind it. WWE had since they're in partnership still to this day with NBC Universal, Peacock, they had Triple H, a big ad saying that WrestleMania is coming next year to Vegas. But before they introduced it, and this was during the Kentucky Derby, they showed Becky Lynch with her husband. That's not his real name, Seth Rollins, but it looks like he shaved his beard and possibly his head. He's famous for his hair and his beard. And I took a screenshot of it. I'll try to bring that aboard a little bit later. But let me bring aboard Wes Maidment. Wes, where are you now in Manitoba? And you've moved around a bit in that province.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me on today, guys. I'm so excited to be speaking with the famous Dr. Mike. But I live in Manitoba right now, just north of Winnipeg. I moved out here 3 years ago to be closer to my daughter. I only have one kid. I spent my whole 60 years plus of my life in Southern Ontario. So I'm a huge Frank Tunney, Toronto, Ontario fan, but also since moving out here, I've had to ingrain myself with the AWA, which, I wasn't completely ignorant of, but on the same note, you start delving into a new area and it's all brand new stuff. Mike, first thing I'm going to say, though, is I am a self-professed wrestling crazy history nut. I think that we have to do everything we can to keep wrestling history alive. It's the most important thing in my estimation. I love wrestling history, and it's just something that drives my day.
Russ has heard me talk about this, but I loved Winnipeg because there were quite a few interpromotional world title versus world title matches, particularly 70s, early 80s. The one that I shot, Flair against Nick Bockwinkel. But there was also Rick Martel with the AWA title against Flair's NWA title, Backlund against Flair, Backlund against Nick Bockwinkel. So tremendous history. And Winnipeg, under at least Al Tomko promoter in the 70s, was not strictly an AWA territory. You got unique matchups, like Gene Kiniski would come in from Vancouver, where he was helping run that promotion there. And you'd see a lot of unique stuff. So it wasn't a straight up AWA show, basically the same show, same matches in every AWA city. No, Winnipeg was far different, and it was almost hybridized. And to Maple Leaf and the Tunney family, tremendous history to this day. And Russ, we've talked over the decades and years about Montreal and Toronto in particular being big history towns. And deservedly so, because at the Maple Leaf Gardens, fantastic venue. That was kind of almost the framework. That was the first territory, Wes, you might know, that had a walkway, a long walkway in its day. Did you go to the Tunney Cards? Tell us about that.
The famous ramp. It was my first time going to Maple Leaf Gardens. I got to tell you right now, I was a closet fan when I was a kid. Okay, I never went to any shows when I was in my teens. I only started going in my 20s. None of my friends liked wrestling. Nobody liked wrestling. I had to go myself. So I went to Toronto's Maple Leaf Gardens the first couple times. I was blown away. Ric Flair on a match when the Mid-Atlantic started coming up to Toronto, seeing him walk up the ramp. I think the first match, main event I saw was Snuka versus Flair for the U.S. Mid-Atlantic title. So the history in Maple Leaf Gardens, and not to take any other history away, but Maple Leaf Gardens and the Forum in Montreal were storied. The guys who went through those doors and performed in those rings are of volumes of fantastic reading. So Maple Leaf Gardens was definitely an awesome place. Great atmosphere when you have 10 to 14,000 people in a building. No doubt about it.
Well, we have some incredible legends that came out of Canada. Who, in your opinion, would you rank as the greatest Canadian wrestlers of all time?
I think because on some of my podcasts I've done, we've talked about Whipper Watson at length. And yeah, at my age, I would have basically missed him in his prime, obviously in his prime. But I mean, the guy wrestled from the 40s to the early 70s. But Whipper Watson for sure. And if you're going to go across the border from Ontario to Quebec, we'd be looking at more than likely Yvon Robert. But that's Montreal. Yvon Robert, Whipper Watson, a favorite of mine, without a doubt, is Gene Kiniski. Great self-promoter, fantastic wrestler. And I consider Kiniski one of the last real traveling world NWA champions, because after him, the guys were still great, but they weren't that 365 on the road. He was one of the last guys. Thez, him, and then Harley Race. And then, the 70s turned along. We started getting a champion for 6 months or a year and stuff like that. And it just changed the dynamic of that championship belt. But Kiniski, Watson, and personally, I'll have to admit, I was a big Dewey Robertson fan.
This was before he became.
He was so popular here.
He was super popular as a baby.
I loved him as the missing link. So that's one of my favorite wrestlers of all time.
But he had this history that Wes may not know. He was like semi-main eventing in St. Louis for Sam Munchnick as, under his own name. So he had quite the history in the 70s, well before the missing link thing, which I think debuted. Did it debut for Fritz, or I think it was for Fritz, somewhere thereabouts in Dallas.
World Class. He debuted in World Class,
yeah.
Well before, but he did some other territories, and he worked for Leroy McGurk well before the WWF brought him in. And I forget who was his manager in WWF. Now that's a
Bobby
puzzle
Heenan
there.
Actually was his manager for a very short time. He wasn't in the WWF for very long.
But it is funny, certainly, because Larry Matisick from St. Louis, who was the number 2 guy to Sam Munchnick, has tapes up before he passed away, put them online. So you can watch Dewey Robertson as Dewey Robertson. He might even have some Maple Leaf Garden shows there. I know he wrestled Chris Tolis, who Evan and I are doing, the book on John and Chris Tolis.
Yes.
But very good choices. And, when I covered the Grand Prix promotion, because one of the world's greatest territory wars was Montreal, Grand Prix, which was the Vachon brothers promotion, along with their sister, Vivian, who was probably the most beautiful woman ever in wrestling. And that's saying something. And she could defend herself and was very outstanding. But that was against the Rougeau. And these are Johnny and Ray, the fathers of Jacques and Ray. Yeah. And their which then was renamed later on International. But in the early to mid 70s, Kiniski came into Grand Prix, and there was a wealth. Ed Carpentier, who on this pay-per-view today and SmackDown last night, people were holding up Carpentier for WWE Hall of Fame.
Get out, really?
I was very pleased to see, and this is in France, but people know who Ed Carpentier is many years after his death. He was tremendous. He had a lot of history in my territory, my home base, Los Angeles. But Andre started there, or came to prominence. He started in '68 in Paris, and then along with Carl Gotch and Billy Robinson, they took him to the IWE Japanese promotion in 1970. And the Vachons and Carpentier brought him in, and even Robert Sr. But there's another guy, when you talk about Yvon Robert, his son wrestled in Grand Prix, as did Carpentier. Had 2 nephews. One was Edouard Athifier, and I forget the other one's name, who worked in New Japan. Yeah, Jackie Weiss. That's right.
Yeah.
And I mean, everybody in the world was either with the Bachans or the Rougeaus, and the Jerry Park. I only shot the first Jerry Park one, but this was the biggest one at an outdoor stadium at the height of the territory war. On top was Mad Dog Vachon turning babyface finally. It started as a heel match for the Grand Prix world title, and he beat Killer Kowalski for it. Bruno Sammartino and Ed Carpentier, the Dream Team, beat the original Hollywood Blondes, managed by, we called him Red, but his professional name was Sir Oliver Humperdinck. Donnelly O'Jonathan double disqualification against the fireball throwing Sheik, who booked Toronto before you started. When you watched Toronto and you went, that was when, for some reason, Tunney switched to Mid-Atlantic and brought up all those guys from Charlotte. We still can't figure that one out. Maybe you have some idea. But prior to that, for a good 12, 14 years, the Sheik booked. He had all kinds of matches with Tiger Jeet Singh, everybody, Abdullah the Butcher, Killer Kowalski, the one I shot that was very famous, heel, Sheik against Killer Kowalski at Maple Leaf Gardens. But Canada's got tremendous history, and Wilbur Watson was an NWA world champion. That's picked him and told Muchnick to put the strap on him.
Twice he was, yeah.
Yeah,
so Mike, you talk about Grand Prix, and I've read some of your stories online and little things I found, and how much you loved Carpentier, and he was so big, even in Southern Ontario at the time. I wish I could have seen him live, because one of my favorite wrestlers of all time. The Grand Prix TV show was aired in Toronto. They never came to Toronto, but it was aired on TV. So at one time in the early 70s, and this is phenomenal to think about, we had Stampede out of Calgary. We had All-Star Wrestling out of Vancouver. We had NWF out of Buffalo with Pedro Martinez. We had WWF out of New York City. We had Tunney's Wrestling. We had Grand Prix out of Montreal. And then we had George Cannon also. So we had, it was just a plethora of wrestling. And I tell a story of being yelled and screamed at by my mom, get the hell outside and go play, because Saturday afternoon was locked up with professional wrestling on TV.
Was it just a big block? All the shows?
Pardon me?
Was it a big block of shows, one after another on Saturdays?
Sometimes it was like at 12 o'clock, there was 3 shows on, and all you did was sit in front of the TV, turning the dial back and forth, because you couldn't miss anything.
Is it days before VCRs and digital recording of stuff?
That's right.
But it's interesting. You did just mention Stampede, and of you said your favorite wrestlers, you didn't mention Bret Hart or the Hart family, and so
next on the list. Huge Bret Hart fan. I saw him live a couple times. I really enjoyed him. He brought a lot of, in my eyes, authenticity to the wrestling ring, especially at a time when the WWF was starting to do the goofiest shit. I don't know if I could say that. The goofiest crap.
You've gotten away with it.
Pardon me?
You got away with it now.
At least there was Bret Hart, who was and when he teamed with Neidhart, at least there was something to watch that was real wrestling.
And that was in shining honor, because that was at the time we had to cover the steroid trial and the Ring Boy scandal against Vince.
Yeah.
Narrowly leading, the feds screwed that case up, Russ, on a legal standpoint. And Vince's longtime attorney, I know, Jerry McDivitt, who recently retired, he's the one that took advantage of the fact. But they had an open and shut case, most thought, against Vince. And, that's why he had to do the sympathy angle. He had a huge looking neck brace to get sympathy while testifying in court. And there was nothing wrong with him, allegedly. But when we talk about some of the shows you saw, like the NWF, Pedro Martinez, he put on the 3-ring circus in Ohio. Johnny Powers helped him book and was his lead babyface in both Buffalo, and then I don't know geography, how close Buffalo is to Ohio. So the towns in Ohio that she didn't run, the NWF ran. And have you heard of this thing? Either one of you guys, the wrestling 3-ring circus show in '73. There was
Yeah.
3 rings going on. There'd be like a little person's midget tournament going on here with the top stars, Little Beaver, Sky Lolo, Cowboy Lang, all of them. Then a women's tournament, a women's tag tournament, a men's tag tournament, and then a ton of men's matches like Johnny Power, I think defending the NWF World title, which Inoki purchased. That was Inoki's first title that he brought to New Japan when NWF folded. Johnny Powers just simply sold him the title, dropped it to him. So Johnny Powers defending the title against Johnny Valentine, Ernie Ladd against Waldo Von Erich, Abdullah the Butcher, I forget if he wrestled Pampero Firpo or someone like that, might have been Hans Schmidt, just everybody in the planet. And then they advertised it was going to be the first and only teaming of Chief Jay Strongbow, who was an Italian-American, Joe Scarpa, as you might know, with Wahoo McDaniel, who was a legit Native American, and Wahoo no-showed. But it was going to be historic for everybody who believed and thought Jay Strongbow was, a Native American. He was not, but very colorful and all of that stuff. So that was 1973. But man, you got to see the cream of the crop in television. Vancouver was no slouch with All Star either.
It was just so great. I was thinking about this when we were talking earlier this week about setting this up, and I was thinking about this. I had a book when I was a kid that I wrote down every wrestler I saw on TV, every wrestler from every magazine, all the names, and I had pages and pages and pages of names. And then I started, as I thought I was getting, quote, smarter, I would put little stars beside the guys who I thought were Canadian, because I'm a proud Canadian. I wish I still had the book. I don't, but yeah, we got to see Bob Brown. We got to see Abdullah the Butcher and King Curtis and that out of Stampede. Bob Brown and Kiniski out of Vancouver. It's like some of these guys, we got to see Larry Whistler out of when he was starting out in Vancouver. Some of the guys from Calgary starting out, which was phenomenal. One of my favorite memories from Grand Prix, to go back to Quebec, is I remember seeing Dr. Jerry Graham on TV. And he was just, no offense, he was just this big, fat slob. And he wore the full black T-shirt kind of thing in the ring. And I remember specifically writing his name down in my little book, thinking, oh my God, I got to see Dr. Jerry Graham on TV. So, and like I said, as I was a closet fan, I never went to shows. Like I could have easily went to the shows. I lived in Toronto. I was like, half an hour away on buses and everything when I was a kid. But I just never went, and it would have been great to have seen some of these guys live. But as it turned out, I took what I missed then into the 5 wrestling history Facebook pages that I have now, and I channel all that into them. And it's so enjoyable to see people saying, oh, I remember whoever, you fit the name in, or do you have pictures, or do you know something about this guy? And because I just love doing the research, it's great to help out people and bring back memories. Again, keeping wrestling history alive though, right?
Oh, yeah. And we love history here. Let me throw to Russ, because I've got an overload of stuff I want to talk to you about.
Well, yeah, I wanted to also, there's been a lot of great Canadian tag teams. Who would you say is one of your favorite, or your set of favorite Canadian tag teams?
I think that's a good question, because there wasn't really that many guys that hit their stride all over the world or all over North America. Maybe the Tolos brothers, who you mentioned earlier, because they hit lots of territories. Obviously, John was more famous than Chris, but Chris had a longer career, I think.
He brought in the business first, and in the early 50s, John followed a little bit later. They wrestled. It was researching. Evan and I are doing the book. He nagged me for years to do the book, and we're doing it together. Evan Ginsberg, who's also a historian, on the Tolos brothers, but I had no idea they worked in Mid-Atlantic and Florida for the promoter before Eddie Graham. They were all over the place. And then they had the historic 1965 to 66 for Vince McMahon Sr., where they traded what was then the U.S. tag titles for Vince McMahon Sr.'s Tri-WF, now the WWE. Those tag titles were turned into the WWF or Tri-WF tag titles, but they're in a heel-heel tag feud, the Tolos brothers against fellow heels Killer Kowalski and Gorilla Monsoon. And
who would want to see that?
Yeah, it was amazing. So that would be, Russ, I think most people would say that's probably Canada's greatest classic TV era
well, I
tag
want to know
team.
from Wes. I always know your opinion. You tell me every week what your opinion is. I get to talk to Wes every so often, so I'd like to find out what Wes thinks.
I like Neidhart, and although I don't think Neidhart was Canadian, was he?
No,
he wasn't.
He was from California.
Yeah, exactly. So as much as I like that tag
what about
team,
the Rougeaus? What about
Billy Red Lions and Dewey Robertson held the international tag team title in Toronto for off and on for a few years in the 70s. They're both Canadians. The Love Brothers were a very exciting team.
Oh yeah,
they were both Canadian. No Boston or wherever. They were both Canadian guys.
The Love Brothers were here. They did a lot of AWA shows here in San Francisco, and they had a lot of heat. They would parody the hippie thing, right?
Yeah.
And that generated a lot of heat here in the Bay Area. I remember when they would go up against Pat Patterson and Maivia, and those would be some pretty big feuds. And
they weren't big guys. Like, I mean, they were just as big as I am, like 5'9", 5'10" at the most. Hartford Love actually is still with us. He's still with us and living out in Newfoundland. I'm good friends with his daughter, so that's really cool that we've got that connection. Johnny Evans, which was Reggie's real name, he passed away a few years ago. But I'm tag teams, if you were going to go for half Canadians, my favorite tag team would be the original Hollywood Blondes. I love them guys. They were so good. The cheating, run away from stuff heels, Buddy Roberts and Jerry Brown.
Buddy Roberts later would be with the Freebirds, and Jerry Brown, who passed away not that long ago. But I stayed in touch with Buddy. Buddy Roberts lost his voice box to throat cancer from smoking, and was close to Red. Again, that was what we all called Sir Oliver Humperdinck, Red, because of the red hair. But they got famous in Montreal for Grand Prix. They actually wrestled two great, you didn't mention Joe's and Paul LeDuc, one of the greatest, next to the Bachans, greatest tag teams up in Canada. They were amazing. And then from there, they went to Florida briefly, and then they came and ruled Los Angeles, my home base territory, for 2 years. They came in late '74. They were there nearly forever, feuding with Black Corbin and Great Goliath, Kenji Shibuya and Masa Saito, famous New Japan Mr. Saito, and tons of tag teams, the Interns and the Assassins, and a lot of them. But boy, and you know what? I'm going to ask you if you can't, because both Love Brothers came separately to Cauliflower Alley when we were still in LA. They came with their IWA manager, Bruce Swayze, beautiful Bruce Swayze, who I'm in touch with. But they originally were, they would bop back and forth between the Sheik. They started, I think, with the Sheik, or maybe in Ontario, and then the Sheik brought them into all over Detroit or Michigan, state of Michigan and Ohio, and then they worked for Pedro Martinez as well. But they were part of Eddie Einhorn's IWA, managed by George Crybaby Cannon, and I was his event photographer, but most importantly, he was trying to take on, it was foolish, he was blowing money, he was trying to take on both Sam Muchnick's NWA and more particularly Vince McMahon Sr.'s Tri-WF, couldn't get into Madison Square Garden. He did get TV at the historic New York City Beacon Theater to do his TV, where I shot the only match between their IWA champ Mil Mascaras and Lou Thez. But he had those 3 1975 outdoor Roosevelt Stadium shows in New Jersey that I shot. And I won't, those cards were stacked. You want to talk about stacked cards? Lou Thez came out of curiosity. He brought Ricky Starr, with him to the first outdoor show. Sam Munchdick, who was like not really supposed to be there, came with the Sheik. Johnny Powers came with Antonio Inoki. They all wanted to check out this thing. And Lou Thez and Rick Starr had such a good time backstage with all the boys. There was a ton of talent that weren't even on TV, from Thunderbolt Patterson to Ernie Ladd. Anyway, so Thez would wrestle like Bulldog Brower, who I'm not sure if he was Canadian. He was in Canada quite a bit.
He's in Canada for a long time, yeah.
And so, yeah, so I'll see if you can't get a hold of the surviving Love Brothers daughter, because I have a jillion photos backstage of them goofing off, playing cribbage and chess with Ernie Ladd and Ox Baker and all of these guys. And of course, Cannon and Al Costello of the Fabulous Kangaroos posing with the Love Brothers and stuff. So if you can, Wes, see if you can't get a hold of her, because I think she'd get a kick out of my shots of them in their prime, early 70s.
That's awesome. Well,
now, Wes,
I would put you in check. Go ahead.
It wouldn't be responsible for me to have an interview with a Canadian wrestling historian without asking you. You must have some Iron Mike Sharpe stories.
I don't.
You don't.
I saw him live a couple times. I never saw him. He kind of started here and then split, and then he hit the U.S. and he basically never came back. So he might have had a very, very short time in Canada.
He did bill himself as Canada's greatest athlete,
He did. Good luck to that, because he couldn't touch a candle to Gene Kiniski, but he carved out a great niche for himself, and he had a famous uncle and famous father. So, in the Hamilton area, obviously, if I could list 10 guys that hit it that were out of the area. You mentioned Swayze already. Both Love Brothers were basically from Hamilton. Nick DiCarlo, Dewey was basically from here. Billy Red was from there. And so many guys. The Tolos brothers were from Hamilton. Eric the Red was basically from the Hamilton area. So there's a lot of tradition there.
Yeah, Pepper Martin was from Hamilton. He was a Hamilton boy, and he said was a total hotbed. But before we forget about the Sharpe brothers, they helped Ricky Dozan get going in Japan. Thez and Mike and Ben Sharpe were like the first gaijin or foreigners to help Ricky Dozan in the, 56, 57, get it going, what was the Japan Wrestling Association, that of course spawned Baba and Inoki, who in 72 would form their own promotions well after Ricky Dozan's murder. But Ben and Mike Sharpe, Blassie, Dick Beyer, the sensational intelligent destroyer, they're all close, but they were Ricky Dozan's guys that he brought in regularly for tours. So they were huge. If you
There's
think
some really famous pictures of the Sharpe brothers in Japan drinking massive giant mugs of beer. That's really cool. They would have been out in California, so they hit it really big in California. You may have seen them if you're old enough to, I don't know, but they were stars, superstars for sure.
Oh no, they were in Los Angeles big time. They had a match with Nick Bockwinkel and his father. They were their baby faces. So Nick was just starting in the biz with Warren Bockwinkel. So Warren and Nick, they had a match with the Assassins, the Kangaroos, Rip Hawk and Swede Hansen a little bit later on. The Sharpe brothers were legends, total legends.
And they're huge. They're both like 6'4" or something, right?
Yeah, and I don't know if Mike is still alive, but he was working the indies forever. Some of those guys that were...
No, Mike passed away a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
Okay. Those guys that were Vince Jr.'s enhancement talent, particularly like in the 80s, and they kind of blew it. They put Albano with Mike Sharpe, and then not much happened with it. He wasn't really elevated. He could have been easily a good foe to throw. I know he had matches with Backlund for the title, but in the smaller, for the WWF title at the time, smaller towns, very good hand in the ring, and he still was using that gigantic armband on the indies well after his period of time in the WWF ended.
But I mean, he was huge in Louisiana. He was huge in Mid-South for McGurk. I don't know if he was that when Watts took over there or not, but I know he was big. Mike Sharpe went to went south and was a baby face and then turned into a heel, I think, as he got older, because he probably had more experience, and turned out to be a great heel. And another guy who was not that big, but I mean, he was pretty thick. He was a thick, well-built man, for sure.
Speaking of well-built, what about, like, you didn't mention Dino Bravo?
Yeah. Oh, I saw Dino Bravo from, he was probably 22, 23 years old on TV every week. So he morphed right into, from Montreal to Toronto, and then into the WWF when he won the tag titles with Danucci, I think it was. And then they sent him out to get experience, and he hit California too, especially, Mike, when all those Canadian guys were in California.
He debuted in LA in '74, August of '74, teaming with Victor Rivera, and had quite the history. And then when the Blondes came in, he was already familiar with them from Grand Prix, because he had been there with Gino Brito against the Hollywood Blondes. So he was a mainstay for a good year. He had a lot of junior heavyweight matches, Dino Bravo, because he could really fly before the enhancement, like steroids, etc. He could really fly, and he had matches with Dennis Stamp, who he worked with for Leroy McGurk in the Midwest and Louisiana and Oklahoma. And Dino Bravo was something well before anybody saw him in WWF. And he teamed, a lot of, I forget if he held the tag straps with I think he held the tag straps with Gurria, possibly Sabisco. He was given the tag straps a couple of times. I don't know why they didn't bring him in with Gino Brito, but for the IWA, again, Eddie Einhorn, who co-owned the Chicago White Sox, he brought in Brito and Bravo in '75 and '73. So they were part of the troupe. The babyface tag teams, along with guys like Nelson Royal, teamed with Tex McKenzie. Oh man, there's just a plethora of great Canadians who were all over the place. And Canada, again, before I forget, has produced a lot of fine female wrestlers as well. Velvet McIntyre, I don't know if she's, I forget which province she's from, but
I think she's from BC, British Columbia, I think.
And then Vivian, that whole movie, Vivian Vachon had that movie on her.
The Wrestling Queen.
The name, the Wrestling Queen, and it kind of showed all the women that refused to work for Moolah. They were sort of the independent women, like
exactly.
Nikolai.
Maria Laverne, who was in that movie, she was something else. She was pretty nice looking too, though, have to admit. Lots of Montreal wrestler action in that movie. I watched it maybe 6 months ago again, and I was blown away by the wrestling. It's just so cool to see some of that old stuff when you haven't seen it for a long time.
I would love to, I don't know where it is in storage since we've moved, but I would love to see that, because that came out, I think, a little bit, and it had a theatrical run in like 74, 75. Yeah. And it came out just a little bit before the Sheik's I Like to Hurt People. And we thought we were in hog heaven. We had Vern Gagne as the wrestler in 73, packed with like everybody. Yeah. Crusher and Bruiser against Dick Murdoch and Dusty Rhodes, who were heels. The latter were heels. Then we have Wrestling Queen, Vivian Vachon, Kay Noble, Gene Anton, Betty Nicolai, who was the real person, not Moolah, the real person. Betty Nicolai fought for 3 years to get the women's ban in wrestling in New York State overturned. Yeah. And then, of course, I Like to Hurt People. Just, you have to see it for the Sheik against Dory Funk and Terry Funk alone, the stuff that Sheik did in there. But I wish you got to, it sounds like when you went, tell us more about when you went to Maple Leaf and saw Mid-Atlantic, because the real classic days, not that Mid-Atlantic stuff wasn't great. It was a whole batch of new wrestlers. But in the Sheik's era booking for the Tunnies, you just had, insane stuff going on. And the cards were out of this world. They were fantastic. And, sadly, Chris Tolis a lot. You know why Chris Tolis kind of went back? He had the last run with John. It was the first and only time they wrestled as a tag team, babyfaces, for us in LA for a good 5 months in 1972. And then their sister, who's the only one surviving them, who I'm in touch with via John Tolis' son, Chris Jr. The sister had MS and was wheelchair bound. My mom had the same thing happen. I've got MS. So kind of a special bond. And Chris kind of semi-retired to take care of her 24/7.
Correct.
And he would still accept like jobbing gigs, to put over people at Maple Leaf and maybe the Wolfman, Dave McKigney's traveling shows. Because he still is.
I happen to admit that I'm a bit of a specialist on Dave McKigney. I've had a Facebook page for him now for over 8 years. I'm writing a book about him. I've worked on a documentary that's supposed to be coming out on that. I've followed his career, and I pat myself on the back. I'm the world's expert on the wild man. Let's put it that way. And the guys, Chris Toles worked for him unthanklessly in the openers. He helped the new guys. He taught them how to work in the ring, what to do, how to stay fit. Close relationship. I didn't have a relationship with Chris, but some of the friends I made through wrestling were very close with Chris, and he was a really, really great guy.
Well, we'll have to talk more about that off air or later. Interestingly, I think Dave is teaming with Wolfman Farkas because they had sort of similar caveman look, long hair, long beards. They teamed both for Bruiser and did gigs for Bruiser's opposition in Detroit, the Sheik, in the States. But Dave was more famous, throughout Ontario and perhaps other provinces. That's great. Well, be sure to come back on this show to plug your book when it's done, because he was a fascinating character, and that period when he passed away was in a car accident with some other wrestlers, wasn't it?
Correct, with Adrian Adonis and one of the Kelly twins.
Yeah, Pat and Mike Kelly.
Yeah,
they were, weren't they?
They're sorry.
Weren't Pat and Mike Kelly? They were also Canadian wrestlers.
They're from Hamilton, also. Yes, we could just keep talking about Hamilton all day long. You asked about the Mid-Atlantic and living as a 10-year-old to 15 or 16, whenever Mid-Atlantic started coming up here, the change was like night and day. We saw the Sheik on TV every Saturday, beating some enhancement guy up, getting pushed for the next match, and it was just constantly excuses. And I know it's booking, I know it's the wrestling business, but it was turning into a pile of bullshit is what it was. It was like a bunch of crap. And I've been asked this question. Lots of people have talked about it. We've talked about it on my Facebook page. It's like, what the hell? What was going on? Well, everyone was making money. So they just keep rolling with it. And that was maybe part of Frank's problem. Maybe it was the Sheik's problem. But when Mid-Atlantic came up here, everybody was rejuvenated because, the first thing you see is Flair versus Steamboat on Mid-Atlantic TV. And everyone's exploding because we've never seen any action like this. We've never seen young, hot feuds with young guys that are physically able to put something really special in the ring instead of Sheik pounding someone for 3 minutes with his pencil and then taking off out of the ring. It was a magic time for sure. Magic.
Yeah, it's weird because you have like a violent. Not all of the shows or matches were like that, but then you had the athleticism of Mid-Atlantic. So, yeah, it must have been night and day. Greg Valentine coming in, Big John Studd when he was there. The thing that rejuvenated Mid-Atlantic to begin with, it involved L.A. Russ knows this. My big boss, promoter Mike LaBelle, who was Gene's brother, promised Johnny Valentine the book in '73. So Johnny comes in, he does TV promoting his dream match with John Tolis, who was then back to being a heel, but he had to go to New Japan and do 3 gigs. And while he's over in Japan, Mike LaBelle says, "Oh yeah, I know I promised you the book, the pencil, but I'm going to give it to Louis Tillet, who is French Canadian out of Montreal, working out of Atlanta office." And Johnny told Mike LaBelle to F himself. And then got the gig from the Crockett's, Crockett Jr. and Crockett Sr. to come in and revitalize from what was sort of getting to be a boring, Mid-Atlantic for 10 years was like old men tag teams, and that's all it was.
Yeah.
And Johnny just said, he had a meeting. He brought in Flair and all of these guys, but he also brought in Buddy Rogers to lend his credibility to help transform Ric Flair into Nature Boy.
That's
So
right.
all of these things happening to make Mid-Atlantic like perhaps one of the most exciting wrestling offices outside of St. Louis or Eddie Graham's Florida. And then you guys get the benefit of that when you switched from, Lord Leighton against Sheik for about the billionth time type stuff. You know what I'm talking about, Wes?
Yeah, and it was making money. I've made a big collection of ads. One of my favorite things is ads and the stories and the newspaper articles. So when you look through the Toronto stuff, you see Christmas time, it was Bobo and Lord Athol Leighton against the Sheik, maybe just right around Christmas time and then right around the middle of the summer. So it was paydays for the guys who put the time in. And then when the Mid-Atlantic started coming up here, at the time I didn't know anyways, that Flair would say signed to come up to Toronto for 3 matches for X amount of money, and it's a hassle, it's a long trip, it's a blah blah blah, but it was re-energized like crazy, and the fans went berserk. And Maple Leaf Gardens had a resurgence. And then, oh gosh, you just throw in, let's bring in Nick Bockwinkel and Heenan, and Mosca and Maivia were feuding at the time. Mosca was a heel. Let's bring those guys in too, and let's throw that in the mix. The money that Tunney probably saved by not booking the Sheik and giving him a percentage of the gate and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, he was probably allowed to pay these guys all handsomely to come in. Who wouldn't want to work in Maple Leaf Gardens? Who wouldn't want to work in St. Louis or in Tampa or in LA at the Cow Palace? It was a resurgence of fantastic. Everyone still is just enamored by the Mid-Atlantic territory and the Mid-Atlantic coming up to Canada.
One guy who I met the day he came into LA came in for our 1976 22-man battle royal at the Olympic Auditorium, Roddy Piper. I'm still tight with his kids and his widow Kitty, because Cyndi Lauper, for example, was on Drew Barrymore yesterday, and they spent like 12 minutes talking about wrestling. Drew Barrymore is all into WWF now, and they were talking about Cyndi Lauper. Why isn't she in the WWE Hall of Fame? And they name dropped Roddy. But Roderick Toombs, he came in. He didn't have his gimmick all set. Our then booker, we got rid of Louis Tillet, had Leo Garibaldi, famous wrestler in a father and son tag team, and he finessed the Roddy Piper gimmick, heel gimmick, because Roddy came in as like a milquetoast babyface. He was in the opener of Battle Royal against Tony Rocco, and within a week, Leo and he put together the bagpipes, the kilt, the whole thing. And then Roddy's like the only guy in the territory days to be champion in 2 territories at once. My secondary territory was San Francisco Roy Shire, doing the same thing, shooting for the program and the magazine's ringside. Roddy held the U.S. title there at the same time he held the America's title in L.A. In Los Angeles. You didn't have that happening. And he and his best friend at the time, Lonnie Moondog Mayne, would team in L.A. as heels, but Lonnie was a babyface after turning against Don Morocco in San Francisco, so he would oppose Roddy. They'd battle over the U.S. title. But Roddy Piper came up to the Maple Leaf Garden, because he was part of Tunney's troupe. I don't know. Do you remember him wrestling on those Maple Leaf shows at all?
Oh, we saw the tag team title change from Kernodle and Slaughter to Jay Youngblood and Ricky Steamboat, even though they had already won the title in the Crockett territory. We didn't know that, of course. Piper versus Flair and the was the main event, but it was the second main event because the cage match was last. And I've always said on a lot of my podcasts and a lot of my things that we've put out in the last years, Ric Flair could come into Toronto and Ric Flair could shit on the ramp and everyone would love it. And Piper was no different. Everyone knew Piper was Canadian. And I'll tell you a couple of funny stories. Since I moved to Manitoba, where, quote, one of the places Piper was from, he did sort of start here. Piper played, this is a story that was told to me, I don't know if this is true or not, but Piper played funerals, standing on top of his van, pumping his bagpipes through the speakers of his van. That seems a little absurd, but if you
You really got into it.
I can bring Wes. I can bring his widow Kitty on, and we can on your show. We can ask her about that because he personally told me a million times about Albano and Blasi stuffing the toilet paper and the paper towels in his bagpipes when he came to do a one time for Vince McMahon Sr. in '77 at Madison Square Garden, and they were getting the Los Angeles TV, so they saw this up and coming skinny, guy that was doing better promos than they were. And they were jealous, were concerned. So they tried to screw up his MSG debut. He wouldn't even ever return until Vince started going national, stealing talent away. And I think he came in December '83 with Paul Orndorff and Dr. D. David Schultz. They came in like a package deal, even though Schultz was coming in from the AWA. Mm-hmm. But yes. We'll just ask Kitty about that one because she would be the ultimate expert. Although maybe his daughter Teal, Ariel, would know too.
What a sad loss, because who didn't love Roddy Piper? I don't care if he was playing the worst of the worst or the best of the best. Just a great talent. I thought I loved him. I loved him so much. Fast hands and an even faster mouth.
Well, Russ knows. He hired me to be, we were longtime friends for decades, but he hired me to be the guy introduced him at his book signings on the West Coast when his first book came out. And so the very first time I did that, Russ, this was Russ remembers, we're on Powell Street in Union Square, San Francisco at the Borders. I had all now it's long gone, but I had all the icons, the mayors of Oakland and San Francisco, specifically, or more importantly, Willie Brown presented with keys to the city to both San Francisco and Oakland, proclamation plaques. But Roddy had no idea. I got a free the volunteer bagpipe troupe of San Francisco. He comes out of the elevator, and the bagpipes players, like 10 of them, are behind him, just like at WrestleMania. But smaller troupe. But he had no idea. He was kind of blown away. And I would recreate that at all the other Barnes and Noble and Borders stores we went to, and they played behind him. And I did the Q&A with him and introduced him and did the warm up. But a lot of great Roddy Piper. Yeah, and to see that early Los Angeles stuff from '76 and '77, his San Francisco work, his Portland work, well before he got to Mid Atlantic, and he and Steamboat, were best man at Flair's. Well, I think Flair's second of many marriages.
One of them?
They were very tight. Flair, Steamboat, and Piper, extremely tight, and they came from totally different backgrounds and stuff. Although Flair and Steamboat were trained by Verne Gagne, and broke in that famous first camp. Billy Robinson, who was a god in Canada too, even though he was from the UK.
Yeah.
And Verne. Yeah. We've got to wrap up, but Russ, let me see if you have some questions, then I'll have Russ ask you to plug everything you'd like to plug, Russ.
Yeah, it does. I'm always mystified by the fact that Canadians make some of the most politest people on the face of the earth, yet they are some of the fiercest wrestlers in the ring. How do you deal with that dichotomy that you have some of the politest people, but the wrestlers that you turn out are some of the fiercest?
We certainly are polite. I'm very sorry for that. We are polite people. No doubt about being polite. I could go on about something that bothers me about the difference between Canadians and Americans, but I won't. But maybe it has a lot to do with because we are polite, and when you're in the spotlight, you get the chance to shine. And and I'm not making myself out any better than I am, but just like me being a closet wrestling fan for so many years, and then now I get to talk about on podcasts, I get to talk about my favorite subject of everything. And it's just what a dream come true. So maybe it is. The politeness there's nothing wrong with it, but when you're given the spotlight, people are able to shine. And like Kaniski, what a self-promoter. Mosca was such a self-promoter, whether he was a bad guy or a good guy, always got his name in the newspaper all the time. Yeah, Mosca really wasn't born in Canada, but he lived here most of his life. I thank you very much for having me on. This has been a blast. I love talking wrestling history. And Dr. Mike, it's been a treat being with you and Russ today. It's just a dream come true again. Like I get goosebumps when I get to talk about wrestling. It's so much fun. I have 5 Facebook pages for Deal with Wrestling History. One is called the National Wrestling Clippings Alliance. That's NWCA. And it basically covers the whole world. We do ads from newspapers, pictures, programs, posters from all over the world. I usually do 2, 3, 5 posts a day. I have a Ric Flair tribute page. I have a British Columbia tribute page. I have an Ontario Wrestling Clippings of the Past page, which we're dealing with mostly just Ontario stuff and guys who worked here. And then my Wildman page, which is, like I said, it's 8 years old now. It's got 1,500 members. And we talk about all the people who wrestled in Dave McKegney's territory over the years, about his start, which was like 1955 with Waldo Von Erich, the Mongol, Baron Cicluna, and then we go right to the end. I do a podcast. I have a new podcast I'm just starting up now called Adventures in Bearland, which have everything to do with the Wild Man, Dave McKegney's promotion. And I've also done a podcast in the past called the NWCA podcast. That's on YouTube. And we basically dissected a card from all around the world about once a month for the last, I think, 2 years. So that's some of the things I'm doing. Again, I just love wrestling history. So it's such a pleasure to come on and talk to you guys.
Well, Wes, I've got a million Angelo Mosca stories. Angelo Mosca used to room when he came to the AWA with Ray Stevens, and he would cook gourmet meals for the boys. But we'll talk about that later. But Ray Stevens always, and I, of course, would pose them for photos. Ray Stevens always put Angelo Mosca over as, his unofficial 4th best friend next to like Heenan and Bockwinkel. And
Nice.
They were just like brothers together on the road. Everybody loved Angelo Mosca, who had a war of words with, what was the, Russ, the Cal Berkeley, the football coach?
Oh, Joe
Angelo
Cap.
Mosca. Yeah, Joe Kopp. That was a famous thing. And when Angelo died, they brought that up in his obituary in the San Francisco Chronicle. The verbal war, even though they got along with Joe Kapp and the Cal Bears.
And if people wanted to contact you, Wes, through social media, how could they do so?
I just want to punch in my name, Wes Maidment, and my pages should come up. I'm on Facebook. I don't do Twitter or X. I don't have whatever any other stuff is. I have my own business. My wife has her own business. We're busy people. I squeeze this all in between time. So yeah, it's Wes Maidment, just like it sounds. And again, thank you so much. This has been such a slice talking.
It's always great to talk to someone who has a big passion about wrestling like we do. So thank you so much, and we'll have you on the show again, especially if you're getting close to publishing a new book. We'd love to have you on.
Awesome. So, thank you very much. That would be nice.
Wes, tomorrow. Merci beaucoup, bonne chance. And thank you so much. Everybody enjoy. Cody's still the champion. Terrific match. I urge you to see him against AJ Styles. It was a very good match.
All right, everyone. That's it for
again.
tonight. We'll see you all next week. Good night, everyone.
Hey, everybody. Wes, I'll email you tomorrow.
Awesome. Thank you.